I'm going to hit record. So we're recording now, and let's get started. So turn off all your distractions. I think that's so funny. I think this was a funny slide to put in there because we're talking about attention. So that's why it's in there. Okay. Next, so executive functions. So attention falls under executive functions. Executive functions are important. They are part of the front part of your brain, the part that has evolved last in humans and not much, if at all, in other species. And what executive functions do is they allow us to engage in planned future behavior. So that's super important. Anything that you want to get done, whether that is, planning to make a meal or planning to coordinate with a friend to go shopping, all those super simple tasks, all the way up to the really complex task, like planning to get a certain type of education so you can have a certain type of career. There's lots of planning that goes into that. All of that requires executive functions. There are several different parts to executive functions. Tonight we're going to talk about attention and the different types of attention. Real quick, I'm just going to go through what these other parts are. So we have working memory. Working memory is whenever you're holding multiple pieces of information in your mind in order to solve a problem. So what I was saying at the beginning that nobody heard was that my working memory was pretty much maxed out. I think that's why it took me so long to figure out that you guys were trying to get my attention. And thank goodness, I just kind of paused and was like, I just need to pay attention to what's flashing, and Zoom gives me a flash whenever everybody starts chatting. So good job, guys. Very good job getting my working memory to calm down so that I could pay attention. It was actually a really good demonstration of attention, right? And then next we have cognitive flexibility. This is whenever you have one problem and you are attempting to find different solutions or look at different dimensions of that one thing. And so we're going to talk about that one a little bit more in just a minute. You can think of it as if you have, like my cup of tea right here has multiple dimensions. It has a weight, it has colors, it has a size, it has a shape. All of those are different dimensions. As children are growing up, they experience typically one dimension they learn about is color. That one happens pretty quickly, and then we start adding in different dimensions over and over and over. I think the word is viscosity. That's actually a dimension of water, and it's one that I don't think most of us really think about very much, or I guess it's a dimension of all fluids. But there's all kinds of different dimensions. With cognitive flexibility, you are learning how to think about different aspects of something in order to have that planning behavior take place. Then the next one's inhibitory control. This is going to be the one, so if you're really interested in ADHD, this is probably going to be the one that you're thinking about whenever your kid might have impulsive outburst or, body movements where they touch things they're not supposed to be touching, or they bump into people, or they get out of their seat, things like that. So inhibitory control means that they have difficulties inhibiting automatic responding. And then the last one, emotion regulation. This one is one that is sort of like a secondary executive function. It's one where if you have a kid with ADHD, or if you've known anybody with ADHD, then you know that it's difficult to regulate the emotions, to stay calm whenever everything's frustrated. I'll give you a for instance with me. At the very beginning, I felt like I was doing about 7 different things and having to give good attention to all of them, and I wasn't doing well at any single thing, very clearly, right? And so my emotions, I was starting to feel anxious and starting to just feel like, I'm messing this up, right? And I actually started having thoughts like, I need to get an assistant. Probably do, but now I feel really calm. Now I feel good. It's because you guys are awesome. Okay, so let's go into attention. So there's 4 kinds of attention. There's sustained attention. Oftentimes I hear parents and teachers talk about this whenever they say that their child has difficulty paying attention throughout the full class period, or they can't pay attention for the full duration of a conversation. So this is going to be length of time. Next will be selective attention. This is whenever the child starts to get distracted by things that are irrelevant in the environment. So whenever your child is getting distracted by other kids in the classroom or by sounds, or maybe, you know, they're supposed to be doing their homework and they get distracted by little irrelevant pieces of the homework, and they're kind of missing the main part of the homework. They're not actually getting to the content that they're supposed to be learning. And then the next one is shifting. So shifting is whenever you are paying attention to one thing and now you have to shift your attention to another thing. A lot of times in therapy world, we call this transitioning. And it can be difficult whenever, so what I've seen is that, especially with kids with this webinar isn't about kids with ADHD. I just figure that a lot of you might be familiar with that. That might be why you joined. And so what I've seen is that with kids with ADHD is that they have difficulty transitioning because they focus so intensely on one particularly preferred topic or activity. And so then for them to shift their attention, pretty uncomfortable for them, and shifting or transitioning is something that comes up quite a bit. And then the last one is divided attention. That was what I was doing just a second ago, was divided attention, like times 5. And so divided attention is whenever you're giving your attention to one thing and to a second thing, and you're monitoring both things ongoingly. It's not that you can do both of them exactly simultaneously, but it's that you're checking in with both of them. You know how people will say like, oh, I'm a good multitasker, I'm a bad multitasker. Our evidence says that people can't really multitask. You can't really do both things at the same time, but you can be good at checking in and switching your attention really quickly so that you're maintaining 2 things, 2 activities, or you can be less good at that. So I want to kind of go through the different feelings that parents sometimes come in, and the first one's feeling frustrated. I would say that I see this the most whenever either the child is young in their toddler preschool years and the attention difficulties are extreme. So maybe the parent has gone to the pediatrician and the pediatrician, you know, is reluctant to really either prescribe medication, or the pediatrician is saying, you know, this is what toddlers or preschoolers do, and recommending behavior therapy, but it's just frustrating. I mean, kids can be dangerous whenever they're not paying attention. And then we have exhaustion, because you're constantly having to double and triple and quadruple check everything. I see this one especially in those middle grade years and teen years with homework and classwork. And sometimes it actually shows up with language. So the parent will ask the child what happened, and the child will say something, right? And then the parent later finds out that that's not exactly what happened, and the parent feels like the child lied to them. But oftentimes, not oftentimes, I shouldn't say that, sometimes it's because the child actually has ADHD. And it's not that the kid was saying a falsehood on purpose. Sometimes it's because the kid never paid attention to the original thing in the first place. Maybe you ask, you know, what did the teacher say about how to do this math problem? The kid might not have ever paid attention to that. And so it's, you know, it's hard for a kid who every single day of their life has difficulty paying attention to then say to you for the 10,000th time, I have no idea. So as you can imagine, lying can be a coping skill for a lot of those kids, but it creates exhaustion in the parents. So then in the last one, of course, is feeling worried. And I think this one kind of gets to maybe the core emotion that's going on, and that's feeling worried for your child, worried that, you know, the big thing that I see is that relationships between parents and their children, whenever their children do have attention difficulties, can start to get pretty strained in those middle childhood years and teenage years. And I think parents start to worry that, you know, their kid might have strained relationships in the future, either romantic relationships, or the kid isn't going to, you know, be a good, consistent friend, or even more so, they're going to have difficulty maintaining a job. Now, of course, I'm referring to a lot of extreme cases, the cases that would get diagnosed with ADHD. But what about those cases where maybe you're just a parent who has a youngish kid, preschool age, and you are, hold on, I got a waiting room person. You have a younger child and you are just wanting to make sure your child develops language. Well, the thing that I'm so excited to tell you about is that you can work on attention. These feelings that you have, that you're coming in with, whether it's just your child's really young and you're just worried that they might be developing attention problems, or if you've kind of been through the gamut and you've fully experienced all these different feelings, all of them are valid. That's why ADHD is a diagnosis, right? Because it is impairing. And these children do end up missing out, and they do end up having difficulties with relationships. And so the thing that I want you to really focus on is why you're here in this webinar, and that's you're moving towards your child by being here and learning these skills. The interesting thing about my work is I'm constantly flipping it on parents, right? So let's pretend that you're the parent that came in to see me and you're saying, oh, little buddy just cannot pay attention. And then we have this long conversation where I start to flip it and I say, okay, you're here and I'm going to ask you to do things. And I love that because that means that you're willing to be empowered. You're willing to do new strategies and take ownership for doing those strategies in order to move towards this amazing relationship with your child and giving your child to have a chance to have really amazing relationships with their peers, their teachers, to go on and have an amazing career where they have really good self-esteem. And then next, I think it clicked whenever I click it. Okay, and then you're a parent who works hard to find and use strong supports that give your family more time for each other. So this is the other thing. So I'm a behaviorist, and with me being a behaviorist, I'm really focused on doing little things that just start to tweak the environment to move a child's development in that healthy direction. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is all about helping the child to have opportunities for healthy growth, to give you as the parent opportunities for those positive interactions that support the child's self-esteem and developing those attention skills. And so this is what I love about parents who seek out these resources, is that not only are they seeking to be empowered, but they're seeking to be empowered in a way that they can do this every single day and everybody in the family can feel good. And you're also being intentional on how you can approach parenting obstacles. So all the strategies that I'm talking about tonight are preventive. I feel like it's really reasonable if across the presentation you have these questions like, what do I do when my child does this? How do I give them consequences for that? Should my kid be punished whenever this happens? All those kinds of things. But I intentionally leave out consequence-based discussion in my online presentations because it can be a little bit dangerous to a lot dangerous, just depending on the child's difficulties. If I had a pretty disabled child that engaged in significant behavior, then that would be very dangerous. So I don't do any of that. I just like to talk about the education piece, the prevention piece, giving all of you out there an idea of what you can do to really support your child. With all of that said, you know, this isn't therapy, this is just educational. But if it sparks some ideas for you, be sure to reach out to your child's pediatrician so that you can get some more support. So a little bit about me. So I've worked with special needs populations for 17 years. In undergrad, I worked in a home facility with developmentally disabled adults. And then right after undergrad, I was a special education teacher for a couple of years. And that was really where I learned about this passion that I have for helping kids. And that's why I do the work that I do. That really led to the rest of my career trajectory. And that was figuring out how to do evidence-based work so that I could truly make a difference in children's lives. One of the things that I noticed as a teacher was that a lot of times, you know, parents come in, they have really good, valid questions, and we don't know what to do as teachers. And we're trying something because somebody told us to do it, but the evidence doesn't really support it, and the kids don't really have a change in behavior. And I didn't like that feeling. That just wasn't sufficient for me. And so that's why I went into school psychology, and I'm a doctoral level school psychologist. And so that means that I do the medical diagnoses as well as being able to go into the school and work with your kid there and their teachers and you. I'm also a behaviorist, so I'm a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst. What that means, again, is that I look at the environment and I find ways to make the environment more clear so that your child's learning rate increases. And so if you're trying to figure out how to make your child more attentive, what we're talking about tonight is how do you take this ownership over the environment so that your child's learning rate on how to be self-reflective and understand how to be attentive, how does that grow even quicker than the normal developmental trajectory, right? Because we want your kid to be super attentive. I do specialize in young children. So kids who are nonverbal, who just haven't learned how to speak yet. I love all of that because I like play. I like to do interventions that are fun for the kid and really relax the parents. And then I also specialize in childhood mental health disorders. Okay, so the thought I want us to start with is that it is possible to support your young child with building attention through everyday interactions that are positive and help keep your relationship strong. One of the things that I want to just kind of talk about is that, you know, a lot of these skills that I'm going to be referring to tonight are meant for young children. So I would say from 2 years old up through 7 years old is what I describe as young, but they can support a bit older than that. What we know in the literature is that the behavior starts to get more rigid at 8 years old and going up. It's not totally rigid, but it starts to get more rigid. And of course, medication therapy for things like ADHD shouldn't be started until after 5 years old, according to American Pediatrics something or another societies. I forget the words that go in that, but one of those organizations led by pediatricians. And that's because the child's brain is so malleable. You can change it so much. In fact, in the teenage years, the brain is still connecting, it's still growing. And we know that the brain isn't fully grown, especially this front part, the frontal cortex, until 26 years old. And so something I want you to really keep in mind is that you're taking ownership of being a coach to help your child to gain these skills in the quickest, most efficient learning environment possible. But oftentimes you might get frustrated because your child's not doing an executive function yet, but they won't have that capacity until maybe a year from now or 3 or 5 years from now. And so keeping that developmental mindset in mind is really important. I think it's interesting because, you know, Like to rent a car, you have to be 25 years old. I think that's the rule. I think it's still the rule. And the reason for that is because there's so many car wrecks between 16 and 25. And I don't know if there's data for this, but I would imagine it's because of executive function. Okay. Alrighty. Now, so big idea for tonight is you have the most influence more than anybody else over your child's potential. And that's potential for anything that you want, whether it's attention, doing well in school, having great friendships, having the best parent-child relationship that you are striving for, whatever it may be, you're the biggest influence because you're the one that can control their environment the most. Probably not perfectly, and that's okay, but probably the most. So the map for tonight, we're going to start with building language. That's foundational. And then we're going to go into building noticing. And then we're going to go into generating momentum. So that's our path for building attention. So let's get started. Okay, so experience improves attention. What does that mean? It means that for us to understand our experience, to even have the memory of experience, we have to have language. So I was reading through this study as I was preparing this webinar, and it was so interesting. They were studying 3- and 4-year-olds, and they were talking about the dimensions. What were they doing? Like shapes and colors, and they were teaching the kids how to sort the shapes, and they did that. The kids did fine. The 3-year-olds did fine. And then they wanted the kids then to sort the shapes by color. So all those different shaped items were also different colors. So now they could go into different groups. The 4-year-olds could do it, okay? So the 4-year-olds understood 2 dimensions of those objects, but the 3-year-olds couldn't do it. And so they decided to do an intervention where the first study, they actually explicitly taught colors to the 3-year-olds. And then in the second intervention, they didn't say anything about colors. They just asked the kids to start sorting. And the kids were then able, and they actually changed the colors of the shapes as well. They used totally new colors. So these are colors the kids hadn't been trained on for language. And the 3-year-olds were then able to sort the shapes by color, even though the kids didn't have a color word for those different colors. And all of this is to say that language is the foundation of executive functioning. Just the research that I was looking through, study after study, was essentially saying, build the child's language. Whenever we have a kid, an infant even, pointing or gesturing, that's going to be related to better executive functioning. So how do we do that? So the first thing is building vocabulary. For your young children, it's really important that you're clear. So that's going to be the difference between having, you're not going to want to do a dark blue and a sky blue and have the kid differentiate between those 2 things, not a 3-year-old, right? Those 2 blues are too close to each other. But, and this is probably why all toys for young kids are primary colors, you are going to want to use those big distinctions. So making it really clear for younger kids. This actually gets me to a big thing that I end up teaching parents a lot whenever I'm doing therapy, and that's just how to bring their language down to a developmentally appropriate level. It's interesting because, I think a lot of people have their thoughts about therapy, they have like stigmas sometimes about it, those kinds of things. What I find is the very young kids, the 3- and 4-year-olds who tend to act up the most, and maybe this is just the segment of population that I work with, I find that they have pretty bright parents, and their parents use pretty big words and pretty complex sentences. And so a big part of our therapy in the beginning is just getting that parent to talk much more simplistically to their child, using short sentences, using simple words, and that alone will tend to get the child to really relax if they're defiant. That will get the child to focus on whatever the parent's trying to get them to focus on. So it's really nice. Next would be using gestures, especially with the toddlers, so the super young ones. Gestures are non-verbal, so or pre-verbal, you might say. So this is going to be before your child has those motor skills to really be able to use verbal language. They're gesturing. All of that's important. So if you have a baby and you're wanting to build their executive functions, use gestures. I know a lot of times, you know, people will, what's that signal for like more, whenever the kid wants more, that's a gesture. And using like smiley faces and just lots and lots of gestures whenever you're communicating with your kid. And then of course, the last one, reading books aloud to your child. I actually was talking to somebody, and I'm gonna do a search for this book, but I was chatting with someone who's reading a research-based book. It's called something like Read Aloud or something like that. And basically it's saying that reading aloud to your kid up through middle school has been shown to improve their vocabulary. And we always knew that it was helpful for young kids, but I found that really interesting that it's helpful even for kids that old. And just behaviorally, what I've noticed is that kids, even through middle school, really enjoy that one-on-one individual time with their parents. So if you're sitting there thinking, my kid's not going to listen to me read them a story, they might. They really might. If you choose a good book, something they're interested in, and you're showing that you're interested in it and that you want to read it with them, they probably would. In my experience, even the super defiant kids who have, you know, attitude problems, those are the ones who really want that attention. So what does reading books aloud do for your child? It exposes them to more vocabulary in different contexts. It's giving them an opportunity to do theory of mind. Theory of mind is whenever you're taking the perspective of somebody else. So fiction is really, really good. I know a lot of people think, you know, for me to be working, I need to be reading nonfiction. I need to be, at least that's the way I've always thought. But reading fiction is so good for your brain because it's helping you to build emotion regulation. It's helping you to understand how somebody might respond in a complex situation, all of that. So yes, read books aloud to your kid. Next, using new words that will help your child self-advocate. So this is actually getting down to the very specific situation that you might be in. If you're finding that you have a situation that keeps coming up over and over and over, then what is it that you would want your kid to say that would help in that situation? If it's frustration around homework, then maybe teaching your kid to ask for a break before they reach the point of having a meltdown, right? That's teaching them to self-advocate. Or if you know that your kid just has like a huge meltdown whenever they haven't had food in a while, teaching them to self-advocate for a snack, things like that. So really helping them to have the words for that. Clearly, the new words part is going to be for the younger kids. For the older kids, a lot of times it is about learning how to say it the right way and even learning their own physical state so they know when they need to say it. Because for it to be effective, they need to say it at the very beginning of the need, not whenever the need is so big they can't handle it anymore. So let's take, again, for instance, the homework situation. If you have a kid who can pay attention really, really well for 15 minutes, and after that they start spacing out, you might start helping your child to notice that so that they start to notice that. Like, oh, I'm starting to chat with my mom about off-topic things more and more and more. That means my brain needs a break. And so after about 15 minutes, I can ask for a brain break and then come back to my homework, and I'll be more effective in doing my homework rather than just wasting time and frustrating myself and my mom. And then the next one, using words that help your child engage how you want them to engage. So this one I find comes up quite often within like play. So like for the young children, you want your kid to respond kindly whenever you say, you know, hand me the toy, and you don't want your kid to just pick up the toy and slam it down or anything like that. So you want to add in words like, hand me the toy gently. Wow, I love how you did that gently. And so teaching them gently and all of that is helping them maybe with their motor movements, a big part of ADHD. It's also directing their attention to their body. So they're learning that vocabulary for gentle, and they're also attending to what gentle means in the real world. So you're doing that through play. So yes, use play, chore time, homework time, to describe objects, describe actions, describe processes and emotions. Whenever you're working on any kind of intervention with your kid, so assuming all of you guys are just so excited to go work on an attention intervention with your kid, then whenever you see your kid tomorrow and you guys are playing or you're starting to do chores, then I think it would be amazing if you think of, I want to fill every moment with chit chat. It doesn't have to be super academic or like this high level chit chat. It can be fun. It can be interesting. It can be a chit chat about what your kid is imagining, you know? So if your kid likes dragons and likes to talk about dragons, then you can do some pretend play with dragons. If your kid is working on how to keep their hands to themselves and you want them to start paying attention to that, right? And notice that, then you might start adding in some of that language in the play of using the dragons as the characters and talking about how proud you are of Billy the dragon and how he was really kind, and now Sarah the dragon doesn't mind playing with him and really enjoys playing with him. So all of that, noticing your own behavior, that's called metacognition. That's so important with attention and behavior regulation with all of ADHD. That's kind of like our goal. That's what we're going for. Whenever I work with kids in the middle ages and early teens and adults, that's my goal, is to get them to start reflecting on their own attention processes. You guys have the benefit, though, with the younger kids up through the middle age kids, that you've got play. Every single day you have play. And even with chores, you can make it playful, or you can instill a sense of pride that your kid's learning how to do something, and you can talk about it. So you have all this opportunity to talk, and add language, add vocabulary, so that your child is learning how to pay attention to when they're paying attention. So let's take, for instance, detail. Like, you want your kid to build selective attention. So you've been wanting your kid to load the dishwasher, but they need to rinse the dishes before they do that. And they don't ever get all the food off. So that's their selective attention. They're not doing it. They're not paying attention to it, right? So what you might do is do it with them. And I would have, if possible, I would have a few plates in there that are pretty much clean or totally clean, depending on what level your kid is at. And whenever they run that totally clean plate under the water and then put it into the dishwasher, I would make a huge deal about it. And I'd be like, whoa, buddy, look at this plate. You didn't leave a single speck of food on it. Does not matter that your kid didn't do anything, because what you're doing is you're training your kid to pay attention to whether or not there's food on the plate. You're waiting for that tiny little success of your kid putting a clean or a rinsed off plate into the dishwasher so that you can then call your child's attention to it. Now, this is the flip reverse of what most parents do, where they notice each plate that goes into the dishwasher that still has food on it. That's calling your child's attention to every error they make. That's really important to think about, okay? If you're a parent who does this, which let me tell you, 95% of parents do this, 99% maybe, I want you to really reflect on that behavior and see if you can reverse it. Because every time your child is noticed for having an error, we call that a criticism. And criticism over time can lead to depression, anxiety, lower performance in school. It's kind of self-defeating. If you sit there and think to yourself, I'm never going to do well, eventually you say to yourself, why even try? And I just get chills whenever I think about it, because I see this a lot. And I see depression in pretty young kids. And I can't say it's a result of, but it often co-occurs with high rates of criticism, not just from parents, but also from teachers, from coaches, all kinds of things. So think about flipping it. It's really hard to do in the beginning, but once you get the hang of it, it's super, super easy to do. And your kid's expression, whenever they notice that you're noticing how well they're doing, that is going to be fuel for you to just keep on doing it. So after vocabulary, you're teaching generalization for discrimination. So this kind of goes back to that study that I was just telling you about with the 3 and the 4-year-olds. So the 3-year-olds needed to know the vocabulary of color, right? They needed to understand that was a dimension. And then that last study, the researchers didn't even say anything about color. They just told the kids to sort. And so that's kind of what you're doing here. You're going to use so much vocabulary to give examples of correct, incorrect, or you're giving examples of tasks that are do now tasks versus tasks that are do later tasks, right? That prioritization tends to be a very prominent difficulty for kids with executive function difficulties. Or even safe versus unsafe behavior. You're going through lots of different examples, and then you're starting to pull back as your kid is able to say, crossing the street whenever the caution light's going and no cars are coming is a safe behavior, and it's unsafe whenever a car's coming to cross the street. Once they're able to say that, then you might generalize a little bit. You might say, okay, now you can ride your bike to school or ride your bike to grandma's or something like that. And so the idea is that you're not having to give them vocabulary for every single example out there. You're helping them to learn how to use their executive function to generalize to rules to govern their behavior. But it starts with vocabulary, guys. It's really good. Okay. So this is what parents say to me, and these are examples from so many different parents I've worked with. So I would say these are like the most common statements that I get. Once a parent's really doing these interventions, which we call it describing in intervention world, I hear parents say, my child is learning so quickly now. So it's so funny because most people feel, or most parents feel that, and teachers have a really bad habit of this. They feel that children learn best whenever they ask a kid a question. And no, that's not right. Children learn best whenever they're actively engaging their brain and putting contingencies together, noticing the different dimensions of objects, right? The different processes that are happening. And your attention, whenever they're doing that, is motivating them. to keep going. So that's building their learning. So whenever you're describing and labeling and building their vocabulary, that is actually holding their attention to what they're doing for longer, and that is helping them to learn. But whenever you ask a question and they don't have that foundational vocabulary and they haven't built up their attention, they haven't learned all the things about that process or that object or whatever, then it's the child, sometimes it's the child guessing the right answer. Or if the child already knows it, then it's just a test, right? So there's not really any real learning happening. My child is able to identify their emotions. That is a foundational skill for emotion regulation. That's something that I have to teach to young kids all the way up to full-grown adults, and it's foundational. If you can't tell what emotion you're feeling, then you can't tell what you need to do in order to regulate your emotion. This is what prevents you from doing the same behavior regardless of what emotion you're feeling. If you only feel good or bad, regardless of what it is, then you might do the same thing over and over for all the bad emotions, and that's what gets people in trouble. All right, my child relaxes more quickly when I label their feelings for them. Oh my gosh, it's 8 p.m. My child relaxes more quickly when I label their feelings for them. My child can play longer and engage in more complex play. I think this is a big one. Don't overlook this one. You want your child to engage in longer and more complex play. Play is the work of childhood. And so if you can sit down and play with your kid, even if it's just Legos or a dollhouse, and you can get that play to go from, let's say, 2 minutes up to 20 minutes, and the play is more complex. There's characters talking to each other, doing all these different kinds of things. You are building attention, okay? And that happens with language, with talking, building that vocabulary. So then the second point, which I will start going much faster, is to build the child's focus. And we've kind of covered these things. They're all sort of interwoven. So it's focus on the environment, what is important that you're trying to get the child to learn that dimension or that process or activity or whatever it is. And then it's also getting the child to focus on themselves, to notice in themselves whenever they're doing something the right way, okay? It's not noticing whenever they've done something wrong. It's whenever they're learning that new skill so that they can do it again in the future. They know what it feels like when they've done it right. Now they can do it again. Attention is taught through directed focus. What you notice, your child will notice. Your perception of them will be theirs too. Keep in mind that all of this language that you're doing, you're building your child's world. Their experience of the world is being created with that language. And so if you're building that language that's super positive, that you're growing, you're learning how to pay attention, right? Instead of saying, you can't pay attention, bud, that's pointing out the error. But if you say, wow, you are learning how to pay attention, you're doing so well. I like how you paid attention right here whenever you wrote your name so neatly. Whatever, you know, whatever it is that the kid's working on, that's helping to build the child's confidence that they can do it, and also specifically on a skill, perhaps handwriting. The way we talk to our children becomes their inner voice. I had a supervisor who had this written in her bathroom at her therapy office. So every time you use the bathroom, you read it. And I thought to myself, for the parents who are coming there for a really long time, it's like indoctrinating them. It indoctrinated me. I read it for a really long time. Okay, so noticing, the way that you notice small improvements, and I mean super, super small improvements. You want to think, okay, attention is along a developmental trajectory, and it might not be appropriate yet for my child to be able to attend for 15 whole minutes. If my kid is only at 2 minutes, then I'm going to praise 3 minutes, right? That's a 50% increase. That's amazing. And so small improvements, praise those. The next one would be single steps. I've always loved the example of teaching your kid to make coffee. I think that that to me is just the most amazing thing ever. You might teach your kid to do certain steps of making coffee, and then as they get old enough and they have, you know, all the skills it's safe for them to do it, they take over the whole thing. But with each step, you praise it so that they're invested. They have the confidence to keep going. They're also noticing when to do it. You know, when do we make coffee? How does mommy like coffee? Bring mommy the coffee in bed, all of that. When your child does the opposite of inattention, if you have a pet peeve, I want you to think about, when does that pet peeve occur? What does my child do during that pet peeve? Like, pretend you have a video camera, you're watching your kid do the pet peeve. What does it literally look like? And I want you to flip it to its opposite. That's what you're going to give attention to as the parent. Whenever you start praising the opposite, then your kid starts to notice whenever they're doing the opposite, which is attention, right? Whenever they're giving attention to whatever, either sustained attention, selective attention, shifting their attention quickly to the next activity, whatever it may be, your kid will notice in themselves that they have that ability and they will do it more. Think of yourself as your child's attention coach. Notice when they're doing it. Notice when they show a new skill. Praise, 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 praise. So the last one, make good consequences follow attention-related behaviors. The definition of reinforcement is increasing the likelihood of a future behavior. Whenever I say praise, a lot of times, I was just talking about this with another behaviorist, parents tend to clench up and they're like, oh, praise doesn't work with my kid. What I really want you to do, I've said praise, but what I actually want you to do is reinforce. The definition of reinforcement is that it does increase the future likelihood of that behavior. So if your kid demonstrates paying attention in whatever way, reinforce it, right? Maybe your kid feels embarrassed whenever you give them praise. That's fine. Maybe instead you give them a fist bump, or you give them a high five, or you pat them on the back, okay? Kids like different things. You know what your kid likes. Do that. It doesn't always have to be candy. In fact, I would probably steer away from that, because you're going to be praising so frequently that it probably wouldn't be healthy. I want you to be, I mean, seriously, you should be praising probably a couple of 100 times a day. It should just be a part of your vernacular. That is how you communicate with your kid, right? Because that's how kids learn. That's how you teach. And you're their primary teacher. Next, applied behavioral analysis is like the physics of behavior. It's happening whether you notice it or not. That's a quote by me. And I'm so proud of it. Because the thing that I get is that from a lot of people is they're like, oh, I don't really do the behaviorism thing. We don't do praises. We don't do rewards. Okay, you can opt out of intentionally giving consequences to your kid. That does not mean that your kid is not getting consequences. It just means that you're not intentionally giving your kid consequences. If you think about it, whenever your kid does something dangerous, right? Like they're on the swing set and they're doing a new trick on the swing set and you're like, oh my gosh, they're about to break their neck. You probably have a facial expression, right? Or you probably scream at the kid or something like that. That has some sort of effect on your kid. For some kids, it may be reinforcing. So it may increase that kid's behavior. For other kids, it might be punishing. So it might decrease the likelihood of that kid doing that behavior again. Just depends on the history that kid has with you and screaming. And so opting out of giving intentional consequences, it doesn't matter. The consequences are still going to apply. My aim is for you guys to be super intentional, have the knowledge so that you can make that learning environment crystal clear so that your kid is developing attention. Praise explicitly. This is especially true for younger children or people with developmental delays or language difficulties. If you don't state explicitly what you're praising, then they might not get the gist of it. And so, yeah, give natural, good consequences. You don't have to do anything like sticker charts or anything like that. It might just be that you say, oh, thank you for helping with dinner, so you get to choose the dessert or something like that. Super easy. I like choice as a consequence. It's really nice. And then lastly would be removing barriers that might impede learning or punish attention. Sometimes whenever kids are learning, things can just become overwhelming or emotional. Remember, your guys' job is to make that learning environment crystal clear. With that in mind, the big thing that I'd like to just mention is video games. If you do have video games in your home and you're listening to this webinar because you would like to support your child in having better attention, then I want you to kind of consider that video games have an extremely high rate of reinforcement for staying on the video game, right? So you can't compete with it. You just can't. I don't think it would be physically possible for you to out-reinforce a video game. And if your kid is feeling cranky and dull and doesn't want to comply with you whenever they're not on video games, maybe consider limiting the video games so that your child gets a more natural rate of reinforcement for most of the day. I do have a video on video games on my website if you want to watch it. As the parent, you have the authority to nourish your child's environment both physically and mentally. You are in charge. So I'm wondering what one tool we discussed that you're excited to use. You can put it in the chat. You can type it in the chat. At first, many parents tell me it's so hard to find something to praise. If you feel like it's going to be super, super difficult, you are not alone. So many parents say that. I don't think I've ever had a parent not say that. But I promise you there is something about your child's attention behavior that you can find to praise. Within weeks, parents typically are saying, my kid listens so well now. And listening so well is usually code for paying attention. Young children's brains are growing rapidly. Change can occur typically within weeks. I think that's something to keep in mind. If this feels daunting at all, the younger your child, the more change you're going to have. You can have change in older children and teens. I think definitely the ownership starts to shift over to your child the older they get. They have to want to have that change too. And they start to become more responsible for their interventions. But if you start earlier, your child's brain hasn't had very long to develop, and so the change can happen quickly. But if your kid, let's say, is 10 years old, they may have had 10 years of practicing overlooking the details on a plate, right? So now you have to retrain that learning history. So I'm looking at Michael. He says, I'm a therapist actually. My son is stressed many of the same things you're referring to, but I appreciate being offered this information to parents. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for attending. I appreciate you being here. All right, guys. The obvious question. I meant to delete that one. That one wasn't supposed to be in there. Okay, so don't wait. Give your opinion. I have the SurveyMonkey link here. It is the same survey from last time. SurveyMonkey tells me it takes 4 minutes to complete this survey. Once you've completed the survey, you just input your email address and you automatically get the handout. I'll tell you this, I created this webinar based on the last survey. And so if you want a specific topic from a webinar, take the survey and tell me what the topic is that you want. That would be great because I'm always looking for feedback. And then here at the very bottom are my references. If you want to take a picture, feel free to go ahead and take a picture. Let me move that. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. Anyways. Okay, if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to let me know what your questions are. And I will stay on for about 5 more minutes. Unless I'm getting questions, I'll stay on a little bit longer. But if not, then I'll sign off. And thank you all for being here so much. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you, Sally. Thanks for being here. So if I hadn't had the technical difficulties at the beginning, we would have ended right on time, guys. Thank you so much for coming back whenever I had those difficulties. I appreciate it. Fall into the trap of criticizing my 6-year-old, so we'll focus on the positive. I love that. Your life is going to change. I think I say your name's Seema, but I'm not sure, and I apologize if I'm saying it incorrectly. Like, your entire world will change. It'll be crazy. I'm so excited. Actually, Seema, will you let me know, like, whenever you start doing it, give it a couple of weeks and send me an email with what happens at home. Oh, awesome. I'm so glad this resonated with you. Thank you for that. I was really hoping I was hitting points that you guys would want to hear about. Fantastic. All right, have a good night. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you all for being here.